They didn't call it slavery. They called it the Labor Clarity Act, an antiseptic title voted through the Galactic Council with a pomp that smelled like disinfectant and old money. In the fine print, human beings were reclassified as biologically resilient primates suitable for bonded transit under senior species supervision. The vote tally lit the dome in cold green. Every block but Earth's raised its sigils. There were speeches about efficiency, heritage, and the needs of ancient economies. There were smiles that meant we found the loophole. The hook pierced the world an hour later when the Calyx Exchange opened its morning slate. A holocaster panned across pens of captured miners from New Kashi, nurses from Sao Vicente Station. A high school robotics team scooped off a field trip shuttle. A dealer tapped a collar with a pen light and said, "Fully compliant, shock threshold, human safe." The camera found a boy with a gap-toothed grin he hadn't grown into yet. He tried to stand taller when his little sister reached for his hand. The pen light clicked and bidding began. Ambassador Rowan Hale stood under the glassy heaven of the council chamber and tried not to taste metal. "You have written a crime," he said into the chamber's harvested hush. "Not an error, not a policy, a crime with dates and signatures." He offered amendments that would have saved face. He appealed to species that sang hymns about mercy when cameras were near. He read, with steady breath, language from Earth's oldest legal scars, sentences hammered out after plantations and camps. The microphones recorded him for the archive called Minority Statements. The victors filed out to celebratory lunches. Earth did not flip tables. It didn't broadcast a dirge or a drumline. It didn't storm exits or break chairs. It did something older and more dangerous in a galaxy that worshipped spectacle. It went still. Transit nets that had once carried human freight went quiet as snow. Pilots canceled contracts without excuse or curse. Union clerks at docks from Ceres to Callan learned again a ritual their great-great-grandparents had taught them. Do not validate wicked manifests. A chaplain in Houston moved cots into the port chapel and pinned a sign to the door. "If you are running, run here." A teacher in Lagos wrote Juneteenth on a whiteboard and told a room full of 14-year-olds that sometimes freedom is a date, and sometimes it is a decision. In a mountain whose spine held old secrets, Admiral Leona Pike turned a key that had waited 3 administrations to be touched. "We prepared for pirates," she said to the officers gathering like a storm front. "We did not imagine we'd need this for a quorum." Screens kindled. Names woke. Lincoln-class heavy emancipators, Tubman and Truth Coverters, Douglas Relays, Jubilee Nets, a software suite stamped with a plain label, Manacle, and a handwritten note beneath it, for when they try chains again. The first night after the vote, Earth's feeds carried no panel debates. They ran a spare chyron, "We are doing logistics. Sing for us while we work." Churches, gurdwaras, synagogues, mosques, longhouses, kitchens, everywhere with a roof and a floor filled with a sound that remembered fields and shipyards and marches and mattresses on gym floors. Across the council's splendid avenues, envoys blinked at the silence like men who mistake stillness for surrender. The Calyx Exchange ran a second auction at noon. By dusk on the second day, the exchange's public servers had been scraped, mirrored, and notarized in 1,000 jurisdictions. Names, ages, ship ID captors, no slogans, just receipts. An old American trick, when someone calls evil by a pretty name, show the invoice. On day 3, a rumor with a rhythm to it began to pass along the unlicensed lanes. Project Jubilee. It was not a weapon you could hold. It was a sentence. Every chain has a seam. Dock workers in the Crex Coalition whispered the seam into phones with cracked screens. An Athurian medic who had once triaged without gloves printed the seam on the back of sterile packs. A Dominion longshoreman, crest dimmed by recent history, painted the seam on a warehouse wall and left brushes on a stool. Rowan Hale asked for an emergency session and got a slot after lunch. He wore a gray suit that fit like resolve. "You did not just criminalize the future," he said. "You tried to pawn it. You need to understand what happens when a people raised on abolition hears you auction a child." Several delegates rolled their eyes. One or two looked at their hands. The speaker called for decorum. Hale closed his tablet and stopped speaking. It was the last polite thing Earth would do that week. The dome glittered like a cathedral. Under it, a young species turned its face toward work. They named nothing after war gods. They named almost everything after workers and witnesses. In the old missile tunnels, crews stenciled FSCME, CIO, IBU across bay doors because the habit of the American story is to remember who actually lifts. The Lincoln-class emancipators looked like floating neighborhoods turned inside out. Hospital bays, barracks, data cores, kitchens, a cathedral of tools. The Tubman covertors were smaller, serious, painted the color of rain. Their hulls drank sensor pings the way a choir drinks breath. Admiral Pike briefed the room not like a general but like a shop foreman at roll call. Jubilee has 4 pillars, she said, tapping a knuckle to the board. Rescue, get bodies out. Ruin, collapse the markets. Record, log everything, no myth-making. Rebuke, make the lesson structural. Colonel Sanna Walsh, a systems engineer who wore her grandmother's Union button on her sleeve, walked them through manacle. Every collar network shares the same sin, central convenience. She said, they update firmware on Fridays, they ping home to report compliance. They trust the cloud like freshman poets trust metaphors. We're going to whisper freedom in their own protocol. Her grin was small and mean the way a locksmith smiles at a padlock marked weatherproof. Rules of engagement, Pike said. Say them. The room, no killing for theater, no starving the poor to punish the rich, no secrets you're ashamed to publish later. And if they shoot, Pike asked. End it, the room said. There were debates because Americans do that when decent people disagree on method. A chaplain with road-worn boots argued for maximal mercy. Take their tools, not their lives. A woman who'd pulled cousins off calyx 2 years back said evenly, some hands won't let go until you break them. Pike didn't force consensus. She wrote both sentences on the whiteboard. Under them, she wrote a third, leave civilians with kitchens, clinics, and schools. Then she circled all 3. Project Jubilee went live not with a fanfare, but with a recipe. At the hour when collar hubs did their weekly firmware push, Manacle rode in on packet headers labeled security compliance. It did 3 things at once. 1, it unlocked every human collar and set a local root key, the wearer's thumbprint. 2, it redirected shock circuits to a closed loop that burned out the pack the next time a guard tried to use it. 3, it marked every hub with a slow leak of metadata. Ship ID, lot numbers, auction houses, bribe ledgers. The leak flowed to public registries stamped plain sight. No passwords, no paywall, evil hates invoices. By the time Calyx noticed, Tubman teams were already on the ground, walking into pens with their palms up and their helmets off. They said the same sentence to every cage. We know your names. For people who had been numbered, this is a sacrament. The exchange tried to smirk its way through. They posted a statement about technical vandalism and cyber terror. They hired mercenaries with polished armor and cheap appetites. They scanned for warships and found hospital boats. They scanned for missiles and found kitchens. The kitchens were bait, they were also true. On the first day, human crews served rice and beans and cornbread to anyone who lined up. The line included guards. A Tubman sergeant fed them too, then arrested the ones who had live collars in their pockets. It is possible to be kind and severe at the same time. Americans learned that in courtrooms and kitchens. Earth's feeds, still lit with the words "we are doing logistics," began to add one more: witness. Helmet cams streamed rescues in raw, boring angles that made editors manic. A girl from New Kashi learning her collar open to her own thumb. A guard's hand trembling above a pocket that no longer contained authority. A foreman reading a printed sheet titled Immediate Labor Protections, realizing that the signatures at the bottom included his own, his name scraped from payroll tables and notarized as a vow he'd never meant to make. The council went from smug to alarmed. Statements flew. The speaker deplored. The exchange denounced. Ancient houses released boilerplate about traditions mischaracterized by outside agitators. A Dominion dock-working union lit a lantern outside its hall and pinned up a hand-painted sign. Jubilee welcome, no questions. Old enemies nodded at one another across soup bowls. In schools on Earth, curriculum bent midweek. Teachers pulled Douglas, Jacobs, Truth, Garrison off shelves. They added Reconstruction, the 13th Amendment, the failures that followed, the long line to civil rights, the stubborn, necessary insistence that freedom is a maintenance task. Students practiced saying abolition without flinching. They did not learn it as nostalgia. They learned it as homework. Pike slept 3 hours that week. When she woke, she walked the bay where Lincoln loomed like a courthouse. Welders had chalked names along her flank. Towns, grandmothers, union halls, a grocery on 125th with a cat that slept on the lotto machine. A child's drawing of a key taped to the bulkhead made the metal feel warmer. On the morning of the 4th day, the exchange tried to raise prices to compensate for supply disruption. The markets churned. The lanterns burned. The collars clicked open. The Calyx exchange ran on confidence. Not just in guards and gates, but in habits. Habits like bribes that cleared in 47 minutes. Habits like debt bundles marked heritage assets. Habits like euphemisms that made a whip sound like a spreadsheet. Jubilee's second pillar, ruin, did not merely smash, it changed habits. Manacle's second stage payload rolled out at 0300 local. A ledger parasite named Jubilee Clerk. It sat in the exchange's clearinghouse, calm as a librarian, and began to annotate. Every lot acquired a tag, illegal human labor, that propagated through derivatives like a song you can't stop humming. Bond desks saw their price graphs turn the color of truth. Risk engines wrote long, sad essays. Exchange lawyers tried to carve out legacy positions. A Jubilee clerk stamped each filing with a giant no and a QR code that resolved to a photo of a child clutching a lunch pail. 2 hours later, the Douglas relays lit. They weren't weapons. They were mirrors. For every auction, the relays broadcast the raw feed to public squares, churches, schools, union halls. No commentary, just invoices and faces. Within a day, 4 systems passed municipal ordinances declaring any ship carrying bonded primates untouchable by tow or tug. Within 2, an Arthurian monastery posted bail for 100 human families and offered a dormitory full of clean blankets and modest prayers answered with immodest speed. Guards who thought they were hard men met kindergarten teachers with clipboards. Names, the teachers said. Family contacts, allergies, favorite color. In the presence of paperwork conducted for a child's good, some men remembered theirs. Calyx tried violence next. A mercenary crew in matte black armor shifted to live fire at Gate 7. A Tubman team slid a flexible barrier across the corridor that drank impact like rain drinks dust. Behind it, 2 Marines in patched gauntlets cut collars with little saws and hummed This Little Light of Mine off-key. A guard fired a stun baton into an open collar and learned, abruptly, how heat feels when it lives in your own palm. He sat down very carefully and began to cry. A Tubman corpsman taped lidocaine across his hand and said, "You're going to court. Don't be late." Pike had promised record, and she kept it. Every rescue generated a packet. Names, dates, captors, auction house, condition on intake, location of release, clinic file for follow-up, reparations account seeded with fines levied on exchange, security. The packets were uploaded to plain sight and pushed to the witness bench that had formed spontaneously out of dock unions and parish councils. When the council demanded a proprietary portal, 47 species replied with the most dangerous word in a language that had learned to distrust polished doors. No. Rowan Hale re-entered the chamber at noon on the 5th day with a stack of paper. He laid it down and the table groaned a little. "Your act made invoices," he said to the dome. "Meet your invoices." He read names for 9 minutes because sometimes the right thing is not clever. Then he asked for a vote to repeal. He did not get one. He did not shout. He put the stack down next to the speaker's dais and said, "When you remember you're tired of being the kind of men who keep this stack from getting thinner, call me." The first warning went out that evening, not a threat, a boundary. Pike read it in a voice that had become a kind of instrument. To all parties engaged in capture, sale, transport, or financing of human beings, you are invited to stop. You will be audited. You will be fined. You will be put to work building what you broke. If you continue, we will remove your capacity to be dangerous. We prefer mercy. We are very good at ending things. The exchange laughed on a private band. They counted their mercenaries and their captured contracts. They trusted the math that had kept them fat for a century. They requisitioned heavier guns, called in favors with navies that wore old medals, and updated their security doctrine to include the phrase human insurgency. In kitchens on liberated piers, elders shook their heads the way farmers do when a storm line brightens. "They're going to make us teach the lesson," a Crex grandmother said, ladling soup into cups. "Fine, but feed the children first." On day 6, a convoy of slaver escorts gathered at Calyx High, hulls bristling, flags bright. They flew under the sign of every species that had voted aye. Their mission brief was 2 words long: restore confidence. In Cheyenne, Pike closed her eyes for the length of a breath that remembered sermons and funerals and fireworks. "Bring Lincoln to readiness," she said. "Wake the Harriet batteries, load the garrison lances, call the chaplains. Tonight we do rebuke." Lincoln rose from the dock like a courthouse with engines. She wore no decals but the names welders had chalked and a little painted key near her prow. When she cleared the mountain's shadow, she did not broadcast an anthem. She broadcast the rules. "Sanctuary," Pike's voice said across every band. "Marked clinics, schools, creches, and food lines are untouchable. Witness, 2 independent beacons will record every engagement. The raw feed will be public. Proportion, we will not burn worlds. We will end specific capacities. Reparations, you will build what you broke. Boundaries, stop now or be stopped." The slaver convoy filed itself into a wedge. Their doctrine was old: interdict, isolate, intimidate. They hailed with the confidence of men who think law is a pretty noise you make before doing what you wanted. "Human vessel you are in violation of your paperwork," Pike said. "Yes, we're here about your people work." She didn't fire first. She turned on a chorus field. Engineers describe it as a harmonized array of graviton projectors tuned to resonate with the very specific configurations found in manacle architectures. The racks, the cages, the switch boxes, the holds. It did nothing to a school, a kitchen, a clinic, a civilian berth. It did everything to a slaver's tools. Across the convoy, restraints buckled like rotten fence wire. Cargo hatches blew their bolts and planted themselves harmlessly against bulkheads. Stun batons discharged into the wrists that held them. Compartment doors labeled compliance came off their tracks and slid gently into the recycling chute. A captain cursed and ordered live fire. The first volley streaked, bright as betrayal. Lincoln's garrison lances spoke once each, lines of force that didn't explode so much as decide. Guns went silent. Power rails opened like a book at the end. Pike's crew plotted every shot through a sanctuary sieve. A school ship drifting behind a slaver cruiser never even felt the wind. On a Vrax escort, a lieutenant watched his targeting reticle bloom into a do-not symbol and burst into tears he would not later be ashamed of. The convoy tried boarding. Tubman craft met them mid-tunnel with foam that set like conscience. Marines pushed through in pairs, gloved, quiet, helmet cams on. They said things like, "Here," and "Step back," and "You're safe." Because manuals that work for ER nurses also work in the worst corridors of the worst ships. On the decks of 3 flag vessels, Pike authorized the Harriet batteries, micro-swarm torches that cut engine bells into flower petal trash without touching crew compartments. The ships drifted, suddenly polite. One stubborn flagship kept its guns hot, kept its interlocks hard, kept its captain shouting old words: order, property, tradition. Pike gave him one more broadcast, a picture from his own ledger of the lot he'd sold that morning. A girl with a chipped tooth. The captain's mouth stilled. Tradition at last looked back at him from an angle he could not dominate. He stood down, not from morality, from recognition. It would do. 3 ships did not stand down. They fired at a marked clinic on Calyx High that Jubilee had unfolded from a freighter, red-crossed, lit bright, staffed with nurses who wore their hair under caps because loose hair in an ICU is for movies. The chorus field did nothing to incoming shells. That was the Harriet battery's work. It did it. The escorts died, engines, guns, bridges cut into precise, uninhabitable geometry. The witness feeds did not flinch. 2 beacons recorded from opposite angles. Pike read into the record, voice steady, eyes not kind and not cruel. Rebuke executed, sanctuary defended. Calyx's exchange dome cracked, not with explosion but with evacuation. Traders ran, clerks cried. Guards turned in batons that only hurt the hands that held them. Jubilee clerks stamped transferred to reparations across accounts that had once bought mansions. Debt bundles that wore the faces of children unraveled into school funds and clinic bonds. It is astonishing how quickly a market can remember shame when a ledger refuses euphemism. Rowan Hale returned to the council and did not ask for repeal. He offered terms. "This is over," he said, and for once the dome listened. "You will pass the abolition accords. Article I, personhood is not subject to vote. Article Roman II, sanctuary absolute. Article Roman III, witness permanent, chaired by those harmed. Article Roman IV, reparations, funded first by those who profited. Article V, emancipator right of interdiction, any signatory may fly the lantern to stop trafficking. Abuse of the right earns a decade in dock service under witness eyes. We will help you meet these terms. We will not beg you to." A dozen delegations tried dignity. 100 more tried silence. 200,000 screens in the lanes showed plain sight packets, faces, invoices, the instant a collar opened to a child's thumb. In kitchens on 6 worlds, elders put down ladles and said, "Now." The vote did not come that day, it would come. Meanwhile, the exchange lay quiet under a sky that had remembered how to be a ceiling for the living, not a mirror for the wealthy. Back in the bay, welders chalked new names along Lincoln's flank. Calyx, Gate 7, the girl with the chipped tooth, until she chose her own. Pike walked the line, boots loud, heart louder. She did not feel triumph. She felt maintenance. "Keep cooking," she told a quartermaster. "Keep filming," she told a lance corporal. "Keep counting," she told Walsh. "And sleep when the children do." That night, Earth ran a new Chiron under the old one. "We are doing logistics. The rest of you learn the work." The council expected a duel of speeches. What they got was a syllabus. Rowan Hale brought paper again, names, ledgers, routes, stacked into a dull, frightening mountain. Admiral Leona Pike stood behind him in work blues, not dress whites, a deliberate grammar. "This is a maintenance call." Colonel Sanaa Walsh wheeled in a cart with a sign taped crooked to the side, "Plain sight for upload." Dockers and midwives crowded the galleries, badges pinned to Sunday clothes, hands smelling faintly of rope and sanitizer. A child with a chipped tooth, collar long gone, sat in the front row with a school notebook, pencil ready. The dome adjusted its acoustics, trying to be a cathedral and managing a shop meeting instead. "The Labor Clarity Act is dead," Hale began. "What lives after it will be your character." He didn't wait for permission. He read the abolition accords as if they were already the weather. Article I, personhood. No sapient may be classified as labor, collateral, or bonded under any code. Votes cannot alter this. Budgets cannot excuse it. Article Roman II, sanctuary. Clinics, creches, schools, and food lines are the galaxy's holy places. Any commander who targets them forfeits rank, pension, and passage for a generation. Article Roman III, witness. Make the bench permanent. Fund it with a tithe on port fees. Seat it with those who lost, rotating. Cross-species, paid enough to say no, protected enough to say stop. Its proceedings are public by default, private by exception. Article Roman IV, reparations. Start with who profited. Confiscate exchange assets and earmark them for freed schools, health cohorts, and port safety funds. Fines convert to years of skilled labor under witness supervision. Docks, clinics, habitats. No chains. Paychecks garnished, not souls. Article V, Emancipator Right of Interdiction. Any signatory may fly the lantern to halt trafficking and escort victims to sanctuary. Abuse earns 10 years of dock duty, audited by the bench. Article VI, Anti-Peonage. No debt contracts tied to wages for rescued persons. No training fees attached to freedom. No housing loans that restore the old shackle with new ink. You will not rebuild sharecropping in orbit. The speaker lifted his gavel and found it heavier. You attempt to dictate. We attempt to standardize decency, Hale said. You tried to standardize chains. Pike spoke like a foreman at roll call. The right of interdiction is not a medal, it's a checklist. Your captains will log why, who, how long, what was fed, what was fixed. You will publish it at 15 and 45 like Meridian Gate did. Schedules make saints. A Dominion elder rose, crest dim but steady. What of men like me, he asked, who signed contracts because everyone did and now cannot sleep? The bench chair, an Arthurian nurse whose hands had learned to heal without supplies, answered. Bring your ledger, bring your tools. We will tell you where the nails go. The bench's charter passed with amendments that made it sharper. Note A, every interdiction requires 2 independent beacons. Note B, reparations labor may be dangerous only if the commander would send their own child to the same job. Note C, freed schools will be staffed first by those who were freed, paid at union rates, trained by truth-class school ships that unfold into classrooms, kitchens, and libraries. Note D, the first semester's syllabus will include Douglas, Jacobs, Truth, Reconstruction, Debt Peonage, Why We Failed Then, How We Won't Fail Now. Hale didn't hide our history, he placed it like a cornerstone. America freed and then failed, he said, not as confession theater, but as instruction. We let states invent new manacles, black codes, vagrancy, arrests, debt traps. The accords forbid their spacefaring cousins. If your law smells like those laws, it is illegal on arrival. On the floor, a trade ambassador tried the old magic. What of traditions, entire economies? Traditions that require children to suffer belong in museums with thick glass, Pike said. Your economies can learn to sell something other than misery. We brought manuals. Behind the dais, truth-class school ships spun up their manifest. Literacy, health, civics, machine shop, accounting, repair. In the yards, Douglas relays went from emergency broadcast to curriculum archives. On port walls, Union posters in 6 languages pointed freed families toward apprenticeship halls. A small army of grandmothers assembled in a room with coffee and forms. They became the most feared auditors in 3 sectors. The vote was not thunderous. It was reluctant, practical, frightened, hopeful. Abstainers kept faces like stone. The eye count crept across the dome like dawn learning whether to be brave. When it passed, nobody cheered. That felt right. In kitchens, people hugged and set aside a bowl for the neighbor who was always late. The exchange lobbyists spun. The mercenaries looked at their hands. A steward captain who had once shoved Hazel found a clipboard thrust into his palm by a witness who said, Dock 4's crane has a live wire. Fix that first, then argue. Walsh rolled the card away from the dais and pressed upload. Plain sight flooded with new pages. Accords texts, checklists, forms, where to go maps, the recipe for cooking beans for 300 without wasting salt. On Lincoln's flank, welders chalked a new line, abolition is a maintenance task. When the session ended, the child with the chipped tooth, she preferred not to be the girl anymore, tugged Pike's sleeve. How do you make a right of interdiction into homework? She asked. Pike knelt, boots creaking. We turn it into jobs, she said. Pilots, nurses, cooks, clerks, teachers, electricians, we run a schedule, we publish our mistakes, we fix them, we go to bed on time, we get up early. We keep coming back. The girl wrote fast. People later called it the Jubilee method. She would call it Tuesday. Jubilee did not end at Calix. It discovered tributaries, the penumbra routes, where smaller markets had fed the exchange under names like indenture and transit custody. The abolition accords turned those names to ash. The work that followed had the shape Americans trust, a calendar. Operation Second Exodus rolled at 0500 with the hum of things that shouldn't need poetry to run. Tubman teams hit dorm barges in the shadow of respectable stations and opened doors that had been listed in ledgers as temporary asset safekeeping. Nurses set up triage under cargo cranes. Priests and imams and rabbis blessed a kettle and ladled soup. Marines carried paperwork like the Ark. Not everybody who wore a slaver's badge was a cartoon. A quarter of the guards were cousins of hunger and debt. Under the Accords, the bench wrote them into history as complicit remediable. Their sentence read like a vocational catalog: 15 years dock duty, 8 to 10 in clinic logistics, school after shift, union card on completion, no guns near children ever again. Men cried over clipboards, some for shame, some from the sudden weight of a future that wasn't a pit. The bench's Jubilee courts met in converted port lounges. No wigs, hard chairs. The rules were clipped and unpretty. Every case had a packet, the plain sight dossier with ledgers, footage, intake conditions, witness names. No plea deals that hid names. No performances of remorse. You wanted leniency. Bring a ledger, a tool, and a plan that employed the neighbors you broke. A calyx financier with lacquered nails argued that she had never stepped on a dock. The nurse on the bench replied, "Your signature did," and assessed 20 years of clinic kitchen duty, garnished wages to fund inhalers. Truth class school ships unfolded like origami miracles in moonside lots. Their curriculum stole shamelessly from abolition's long history. Literacy alongside welding, civics beside calculus, a module literally titled How Not to Invent Debt Peonage with New Words. In one bright room, the child with the former chipped tooth, new cap, new name pending, practiced a psychology she did not know had a name, seeing people without letting them lie to her. She read Douglas and wrote, "Freedom is work you share." Human law faced itself, too. A U.S. Solicitor General briefed a packed hanger on our own ugly record. "We are not exempt from the gravity we claim to understand," she said. So, 3 safeguards, public ledgers of every interdiction, independent auditors from species not named human, and sunset clauses on every emergency authority. Reconstruction failed when we let the sunset be a theft. We will not do that in orbit. A few allies stumbled on purpose. A trade bloc tried to privatize sanctuary logistics and sell priority lanes. Walsh published the emails under a boredom license. No spin, just headers and timestamps. The deal died of exposure. A grand old house proposed a Work to Freedom program. The bench printed the phrase on shame posters and hung them in ports. Work to Freedom is slavery with a layaway plan. Some nights it felt like bailing out a sinking cathedral with a teacup. Then a truth teacher sent a still. A grandfather in a reopened clinic learning how to calibrate a pediatric nebulizer. The caption read, "He hasn't smiled in 9 years. It did more for morale than any anthem." A Crex Dock union sent gumbo recipes optimized for low gravity. A Lakota engineer recorded a story about promises and posted it to Douglas Relay. An Arthurian monk taught a class on the ethics of rescue while repairing a toaster in silence. Resistance hardened as markets shrank. The Nadir cartel, the exchange's starving cousin, moved their auction to a dust veil and called it a heritage reenactment. They flew banners, tradition, autonomy, old rights. Pike looked at the feed and didn't sigh. "Plant lanterns on their perimeter," she said. "Make the first ring soup. Make the second ring school. Make the third ring tugs and call the chaplains." The chaplains came with bad coffee and good forms. They had learned from a century of disasters that absolution is not a line but a list. Return what you stole. Learn a trade that heals. Stay when the story isn't about you. Men who had ridden herd on ledgers discovered how very heavy a box of textbooks can be when carried up 5 flights to a truth classroom. In the council, delegates tried to rename things to keep them. Custodial contracts became cultural apprenticeships in one filing. The bench stamped no in a font that made printers sweat. Rowan Hale spoke precisely. If your euphemism cannot survive being read aloud to a group of 14-year-olds without making you wince, you have written a new chain. By month's end, the abolition accords had gone from scandal to schedule. Ports posted sanctuary hours like diner openings. Lantern frequencies became muscle memory for kids with toy radios. Lincoln shifted from fury to ferry, hauling clinics, hauling textbooks, hauling witnesses to ports where judges used to sell verdicts. In a ceremony nobody live-streamed, Pike folded the flag over a pallet of collars fused useless and handed it to the bench's youngest member. "Recycle the metal," she said. "We need desks." The kid nodded, a grave little engineer. The exchanges board released a video with lighting like a eulogy. They promised reform. They hired a poet. The poem was bad. A dockworker unplugged the screen and installed a bulletin board, shifts, audits, a sign-up sheet for the Saturday school build. The lines filled before lunch. They picked an hour that thought it was private. Just before dawn, when watchstanders pour coffee, when engines hum low, when courage is a stack of forms you fill without being thanked. The Nadir cartel's auction lit under a dust veil near a thin red star, invitations whispered as coordinates and winks. They called it a reenactment, which is how cowards frame cruelty as culture. The lots were human families and 24 Dominion orphans taken from a storm-wrecked barge. A quartet played something expensive while handlers checked collars and chatted about vintages. The lantern beacons came on one by one, gentle as porch lights. First soup, then school, then tugs. Pike arrived with Lincoln at station keeping, no trumpets, just the weight of a courthouse settling into its own gravity. Walsh linked Douglas relays to the auction feed and overlaid it with invoices, packet by packet, face by face. The cartel tried to jam. The jammers discovered they were largely decorative when confronted with a public that had learned to mirror everything that mattered. Rowan Hale appeared on their private dais like an accountant with good lighting. "The abolition accords apply here," he said. "So does your grandmother. Do not disgrace either." The cartel trotted out their patriarch, old, slim voice varnished by a century of dinner parties thrown on money that moaned. "Markets are nature," he purred. "You cannot legislate appetite. Humans sold humans, did you not? We merely remember what your own heroes did first." Pike's reply was not a roar. It was a psalm, not a verse, but a protocol named by a chaplain who believed code should pray. Psalm unspooled like a hymn, protocol for sanctuaries and lanterns in markets. It sang in frequencies callers used to fear and used them to lay sanctuary geometry through the hall. Bidders found their paddles unresponsive. Doors found they liked to open for children. The quartet's instruments turned their sheet music to checklists. The tune did not survive. The patriarch sneered. "You will kill commerce to save sentiment." "False dichotomy," Walsh said. "We'll kill your commerce to save people and replace it with work that keeps kitchens open." She flipped Manacle's last switch. The callers listened to thumbprints that weren't supposed to matter and opened. On 3 decks, handlers looked down at empty receptors and up at lantern light. A Dominion child stared at his own hand like a miracle, and then at the human Marine whose gauntlet had a sticker that said, "Hi, I'm here to help." Violence came down the corridor like a bad decision you've practiced. Marines met it with foam and kindness, and the exact force required to stop a gun from meeting a hallway full of lungs. Harriet cutters removed engines from ships named after old slaver houses. Garrison lances spoke once each, neatly, where guns would not listen to grammar. The patriarch did what men like him always do when rhetoric ends, reached for a runner hidden under a dais. It didn't budge. A witness had bolted it to the floor with 4 honest screws and put the receipt on plain sight 40 minutes earlier. "You can be late and honest," the caption had read, "or on time and crooked, we picked." On the dais, Hale didn't grandstand. He unfolded a repairs plan, clinics to build, docks to standardize, schools to staff. He pointed to where the cartel's seized assets would pay for it and not once touched the word mercy without its chaperone boundary. Pike spoke the last warning again, softly. Stop and help, and you will live under the same rules we do. Run, and we will end your capacity to be dangerous. The patriarch opened his mouth to do history's worst impression of a lion. The bench entered the hall, 12 chairs, 12 badges, 12 stairs that had paid for moral clarity with funerals and mortgage payments, and the humility of being wrong and then doing better. The patriarch looked away first. The Nadir auction ended without an explosion big enough for a movie. It ended like so many decent things end, with a clipboard. The Dominion orphans were scanned into a truth classroom by a teacher who had practiced the line "You are safe" until it lost theater and kept meaning. The human families walked under lanterns that made exhaustion look like the border of relief. A mercenary captain signed dock duty papers and asked if he could learn refrigeration maintenance. The witness assigned him to the shift the old men worked because patience is heavy and he needed to carry it. On the way out, the child formerly known by her chipped tooth stopped at a pillar and traced the word reenactment, then underlined act 3 times. "We keep doing the right thing," she said to Pike, outrage and hope given grammar. "Over and over." "Exactly," Pike said. "That's all Psalms are, repetition with attention." Behind them, workers in coveralls took down the auction lights and hung sanctuary hours. Someone taped a recipe to a pillar, gumbo for a crowd, spaceport version. Under it, a note, "Don't skimp on okra, don't skimp on justice either." The lanterns stayed on. The cartel's banners came down and were cut into rags. A year later, the words Labor Clarity Act survived only in footnotes and in the whispered inventory of regret. The abolition accords had become municipal, posted on corkboards next to shift assignments, printed on the back of port ID, recited in classrooms the way kids used to mutter multiplication. Lantern beacons weren't just human anymore. A Krex patrol flew the frequency while escorting a school ship. An Arthurian monastery installed a beacon in its bell tower. A Dominion Union Hall painted one over the door and called it a roof. Lincoln no longer looked like Fury. She looked like a bus depot built by careful hands, bays opening into clinics and classrooms and kitchens and courtrooms that smelled like fresh paper and coffee that had been tolerated for justice's sake. Along her flank, the chalked names had been sealed under clearcoat, not to freeze them, but to keep them from washing away before the next layer. There was room for more. There is always room for more. The witness bench settled into the most radical rhythm any power can accept, office hours. Not thunder, but a door with a posted time. Bring your grievance. Bring your ledger. Bring your plan to make it right. The hardest cases were boring: payrolls, housing for freed families, apprenticeship slots that didn't quite exist yet. Boredom, it turned out, is what justice looks like when it's working. The bench kept pens that wrote through grease. Truth class schools built freed halls that felt like congregations. Library, shop, clinic, kitchen, playground under a skylight patched from a cargo dome. The first graduations stumbled, then danced. Caps were mostly borrowed. Tassels looked like crests that hadn't quite learned dignity again. Speeches were short. The line for stew was long. A tubman's sergeant cried into a paper plate and didn't hide it. A Dominion grandmother insisted on teaching a unit called What We Did Then, What We Do Now, and teenagers tried not to look moved. Reparations weren't a check you mailed to history. They were payroll and building code and the steady humiliation of admitting your roof leaks and letting the neighbor with the right wrench fix it while you take notes. A former exchange lawyer became the best grant writer in 3 sectors. A mercenary who had tried to be terrifying learned that refrigeration keeps vaccines from dying. He was prouder of the cold chain than his medals. Earth didn't pretend this was our first abolition. We taught the failure of the first alongside the work of the second. In a hangar in Alabama, kids assembled a timeline. Emancipation, Reconstruction, Retreat, Jim Crow, Civil Rights, the Long Emergency, Jubilee. Their teacher wrote at the bottom, "Do not outsource courage." In a synagogue on Ceres, an elder read the Exodus and then a plain sight packet. Nobody clapped. The girl with the new cap chose a name, not the one the exchange wrote, not the one the papers used. Ruth, because her truth teacher had read her a story about a loyalty that crossed borders and did the dishes afterward. She practiced signing it at the bottom of the forms she now loved filling. Ruth, freed, apprentice electrician, lantern crew. Most nights, she fell asleep with a manual open on her chest. Some evenings, she stood on the Lincoln's observation deck and watched beacons shimmer across lanes like porch lights on a street where you finally know your neighbors. Rowan Hale retired his stack of paper for a stack of forms labeled renewal. He kept one page from the old pile pinned to his wall, a receipt from Calix with a line item lot 47, minor chipped tooth. He had circled lot into Ruth in red ink the day she called him sir in a hallway and asked if lawyers ever sleep. He told her the truth. Not enough. Pike went home for a while. She planted tomatoes badly and fixed her neighbor's gutters well. She didn't wear medals to the grocery. Once a month, she stood in the back of a truth classroom and watched kids assemble beacons out of scrap and patience. She said almost nothing. One afternoon, she drew a lantern on the corner of the whiteboard and wrote, "Keep showing up." The room sighed like a ship settling into happy ballast. Some species still sneered. Some abstainers remained abstinent. That's all right. Standards don't require universal applause. They require maintenance. Ports posted sanctuary hours even when nobody was looking. Tug captains added lantern checks to their pre-flight. Cooks trained new hands to make soup that tasted like somebody was glad you arrived. The Douglas relays hummed with lectures, lullabies, depositions, and lesson plans that began. Name 3 ways to keep freedom from decaying. A boy in a far system copied the lantern frequency into his notebook and taught it to his little sister, who taught it to her plush. A Crex janitor polished a memorial plaque to those rescued and those who helped, cinnamon-scented hands moving with the care of someone who had found work that meant something and did it the way saints do floors. A Dominion Union Hall voted to fund a truth module on labor law, and the motion passed with a roar that used to mean war and now meant wages paid on time. Under a not particularly special sky, Ruth walked into a Freed Hall kitchen on second shift and checked the checklist. She initialed the boxes. Soup hot, lantern lit. Audit posted, kids loud. She looked up at the beacon blinking like a slow, kind metronome and felt the shape of a future that was not a promise but a plan. HFY tales sometimes end with a threat. Jubilee ended with a calendar, not less dangerous for it more. Sanctuary at 8, witness at 9, training at noon, repairs at 3, office hours at 4, lantern check at dusk. The council had tried to legislate a chain. Earth replied with fury, and then with the only thing fury can justify: the long, boring, holy work of keeping each other free.